Forget everything you think you know about William Wallace's death. The Hollywood version was sanitized for audiences who couldn't handle the real horror of what happened on August 23, 1305, in London. The truth is that Wallace was subjected to the most sadistic execution method ever devised by human cruelty, a torture so prolonged and barbaric that it was designed to keep him conscious and screaming for hours while his body was systematically destroyed. What King Edward I ordered wasn't just an execution. It was a public spectacle of such unprecedented brutality that even hardened medieval crowds were sickened by what they witnessed. The real story of William Wallace's final day reveals depths of human cruelty that will haunt you long after you hear it. Before we dive into the most horrific execution in medieval history, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what really happened to William Wallace was so brutal that most history books refuse to describe it in detail. William Wallace had spent the better part of 8 years as the most hunted man in Britain, a Scottish knight whose very existence represented a mortal threat to King Edward I's dream of uniting Britain under English rule. By 1305, Wallace was no longer the triumphant victor of Stirling Bridge, who had humiliated English armies and inspired Scottish independence. He was an exhausted fugitive, betrayed by his own countrymen, and sold to the English for the promise of lands and titles. The capture of Wallace in August 1305 near Glasgow was the culmination of years of relentless pursuit by Edward's agents. John de Menteith, a Scottish nobleman who had once fought alongside Wallace, delivered the betrayal that finally brought Scotland's greatest hero into English hands. The irony was bitter. Wallace, who had spent years fighting against Scottish nobles who collaborated with the English, was ultimately destroyed by exactly the kind of treachery he had always opposed. King Edward I, known as Longshanks for his imposing height and Hammer of the Scots for his brutal campaigns, saw Wallace's capture as the perfect opportunity to send a message to anyone who dared resist English rule. Edward was not content with simply executing a rebel. He wanted to create a spectacle so horrifying that it would crush Scottish resistance for generations. The king personally designed Wallace's punishment, drawing from the most sadistic traditions of medieval justice to create what would become the template for the execution of traitors. The charges against Wallace were carefully crafted to justify the extreme punishment Edward had planned. Wallace was accused of treason against a king he had never sworn allegiance to, murder for killing English soldiers in battle, arson for burning English-held towns, and sacrilege for allegedly desecrating churches. Each charge carried its own traditional punishment, and Edward decreed that Wallace would suffer all of them in sequence, a legal perversion that created the framework for hours of systematic torture. Wallace was transported to London in chains, paraded through hostile English crowds who had been told he was a savage barbarian who murdered innocent civilians. The propaganda campaign against him had been thorough and effective. Most English people genuinely believed they were witnessing the punishment of a monster rather than the execution of a patriot who had fought for his country's freedom. During his journey to London and his imprisonment in the Tower, Wallace maintained the dignity and courage that had made him a legendary figure. Guards reported that he showed no fear of his approaching death and continued to assert that he could not be guilty of treason against a king he had never recognized as his sovereign. His defiance only strengthened Edward's resolve to make his execution an unforgettable demonstration of English power. The location chosen for Wallace's execution was carefully selected for maximum symbolic impact. Smithfield, just outside London's walls, was traditionally used for the execution of traitors and heretics. The open field could accommodate the thousands of spectators Edward wanted to witness his triumph, while its location outside the city proper allowed for the kind of prolonged, messy execution that would have been impractical in London's narrow streets. Wallace spent his final night in prayer, knowing that the morning would bring horrors that few human beings had ever been forced to endure. August 23rd, 1305, dawned gray and cold in London, but by early morning, thousands of spectators had already gathered at Smithfield to witness what King Edward the Promised would be the most spectacular execution in English history. William Wallace was dragged from his cell in the Tower of London and loaded onto a hurdle, a wooden frame that would be pulled through the streets by horses, ensuring that his body would be battered and bloodied before the real torture even began. The journey from the Tower to Smithfield was designed as the first stage of Wallace's punishment. Tied face up to the hurdle, he was dragged through London's cobblestone streets while crowds jeered and threw refuse at him. The rough stones tore at his back and head, leaving him bloodied and bruised by the time he reached the execution site. This preliminary torture served both practical and psychological purposes. It weakened Wallace physically, while demonstrating to the crowd that he was no longer the feared warrior who had defeated English armies. At Smithfield, Wallace found himself facing a scene that resembled nothing so much as a medieval carnival of death. A massive crowd had gathered. Estimates suggest between 10 and 20,000 people came to witness the execution, including nobles, clergy, merchants, and common citizens. Temporary wooden stands had been erected for distinguished guests, while vendors moved through the crowd selling food and drink, treating the execution as a form of entertainment. The execution apparatus itself was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. A tall wooden scaffold had been constructed, equipped with pulleys, ropes, and iron implements designed to facilitate each stage of Wallace's punishment. Braziers burned nearby, heating the iron tools that would be used to torture him, while a wooden table held the knives and other implements needed for the final, most horrific phases of his execution. King Edward I was not present. He remained at Westminster, unwilling to soil himself with direct participation, but eager to receive detailed reports of Wallace's suffering. However, his representatives were positioned prominently near the scaffold, ready to ensure that every aspect of the king's carefully planned torture was carried out exactly as ordered. Wallace was forced to stand before the crowd, while the charges against him were read aloud in both English and French. A contemporary chronicle records that he was given one final opportunity to confess his crimes and beg for mercy, which might have earned him the kindness of a quick beheading instead of the prolonged torture that awaited him. Wallace's response was defiant to the end. He declared that he could not be guilty of treason against a king he had never acknowledged, and that he regretted nothing he had done in defense of Scotland's freedom. This defiance sealed his fate and ensured that Edward's carefully planned torture would proceed without any merciful modifications. The executioner, a professional torturer brought in specifically for this occasion, began the horrific process that would transform William Wallace from a living human being into a barely recognizable collection of body parts, all while keeping him conscious and aware of every moment of his agony. The crowd fell silent as the true horror of medieval justice began to unfold before their eyes. The execution of William Wallace followed the prescribed ritual for traitors with methodical precision, each stage designed to inflict maximum pain while ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. The executioner began with hanging, but this was not the quick death by broken neck that might show mercy. Instead, Wallace was partially hanged, lifted just high enough that the rope around his neck would slowly strangle him while leaving his feet barely touching the ground. Wallace struggled against the rope for several agonizing minutes, his face turning purple as he fought for breath, while the crowd watched his desperate attempts to find footing that might relieve the pressure on his throat. Just as unconsciousness began to claim him, he was cut down and allowed to recover enough breath to remain aware of what would happen next. The timing was crucial. Too long hanging would kill him prematurely. Too short would not provide sufficient suffering for the spectacle Edward had demanded. While Wallace gasped and coughed, trying to restore circulation to his damaged throat, the executioner prepared for the next phase: emasculation and disembowelment. Medieval chroniclers describe this as the most horrific part of the execution, when Wallace was stripped naked and castrated while fully conscious. His genitals were cut off and thrown into the fire that burned nearby, while he was forced to watch his own body parts consumed by flames. The disembowelment that followed was a masterclass in prolonged torture. The executioner made a careful incision in Wallace's abdomen, ensuring that he cut deep enough to expose the internal organs, but not so deep as to cause immediate death from blood loss. Wallace's intestines were slowly pulled from his body while he remained conscious, the executioner working with the skill of a surgeon to avoid cutting any major blood vessels that might end the torture prematurely. Contemporary accounts describe Wallace's extraordinary endurance during this phase of his execution. Despite the unimaginable pain, he remained conscious and aware, even managing to speak coherently when questioned by officials. His intestines, like his genitals, were thrown into the fire while he watched, the smell of his own burning flesh adding to the horror of his situation. The crowd's reaction to this prolonged torture was mixed and telling. While some spectators cheered and jeered, many others were visibly sickened by the brutality they were witnessing. Several contemporary chroniclers noted that even hardened medieval audiences, accustomed to public executions, found Wallace's torture difficult to watch. Some spectators left the scene entirely, unable to stomach the systematic destruction of a human being. Throughout this ordeal, Wallace's remarkable physical and mental strength allowed him to survive far longer than most victims of such torture. The executioner had to repeatedly pause to allow Wallace to recover enough consciousness to fully experience each new phase of his destruction. Medieval medicine, such as it was, included knowledge of how to prolong torture while keeping victims alive, skills that were put to full use in Wallace's execution. As the disembowelment continued, Wallace finally began to show signs that his body was approaching the limits of human endurance, but the worst of his ordeal was still to come. As William Wallace's life finally began to ebb away from the catastrophic trauma inflicted on his body, the executioner prepared for the final stage of the punishment that would complete King Edward I's vision of absolute humiliation. Even as Wallace's consciousness faded, the systematic destruction of his corpse continued with the beheading and quartering that would scatter his remains across Britain as a warning to future rebels. The beheading, when it finally came, was almost an act of mercy after the hours of torture that had preceded it. Wallace's head was severed with a single stroke of the executioner's axe, ending his conscious suffering, but beginning the final phase of his punishment. The head was immediately placed on a spike to be displayed on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a gruesome reminder of the fate that awaited those who opposed English rule. The quartering that followed was conducted with the same methodical precision that had characterized the entire execution. Wallace's body was divided into 4 parts, each destined for a different Scottish city to maximize the psychological impact of his death. One quarter was sent to Newcastle, another to Berwick, a third to Stirling, and the 4th to Perth. This geographical distribution of his remains was intended to ensure that no corner of Scotland could escape the message of English dominance. The immediate aftermath of Wallace's execution revealed the complex impact of Edward's calculated brutality. While the king had achieved his goal of creating a spectacular demonstration of English power, the execution also transformed Wallace from a defeated rebel into a martyred symbol of Scottish resistance. The very brutality that was supposed to crush Scottish nationalism instead provided it with a powerful rallying point that would inspire future generations. Contemporary chroniclers, both English and Scottish, struggled to describe the execution's impact on those who witnessed it. Many reported that the prolonged torture had actually generated sympathy for Wallace among spectators who had come expecting to see justice served on a dangerous criminal. The gap between Edward's propaganda portrayal of Wallace as a savage barbarian and the dignified, courageous man who faced his torture without breaking created cognitive dissonance that worked against English interests. The execution's impact on Scottish resistance was immediate and profound. Rather than crushing opposition to English rule, Wallace's martyrdom inspired renewed determination among Scottish patriots. Within months of his death, new rebellions began stirring across Scotland, led by men who explicitly invoked Wallace's memory and sacrifice. The very brutality that Edward had hoped would serve as a deterrent instead became a source of inspiration for continued resistance. Robert the Bruce, who would later become Scotland's king and achieve the independence that Wallace had died fighting for, was reportedly deeply affected by the details of Wallace's execution. The unnecessary cruelty of the punishment strengthened Bruce's resolve to continue the fight for Scottish freedom, suggesting that Edward's sadistic spectacle had achieved exactly the opposite of its intended effect. William Wallace's execution remains one of history's most documented examples of how state terror can backfire spectacularly. The man who was supposed to be forgotten became immortal, while the king who ordered his torture is remembered primarily for his cruelty rather than his political achievements. The next time you watch Braveheart, remember that the real William Wallace faced horrors far worse than any movie could show. His execution wasn't just brutal, it was a calculated act of political terror that ultimately backfired, transforming a defeated rebel into an immortal symbol of freedom. If this shocking true story of medieval justice revealed the depths of human cruelty and courage, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold tales from history's darkest moments, and hit that notification bell. Because the most powerful stories are often the ones that show how brutality can never truly gift the human spirit. What other historical executions do you think were worse than their popular depictions? Share your thoughts in the comments below.